The sacred grove of the Silver Mountain clan glowed with ethereal moonlight as hundreds of werewolves gathered for the most important ceremony of their generation. Tonight was the awakening, when fated mates would be revealed through ancient magic that had guided their people for millennia. The air thrummed with anticipation and the complex mix of scents that spoke of pack unity, tradition, and the desperate hope of those seeking their destined partners. Lian stood among the unmated wolves, his heart hammering against his ribs, as he tried to control the nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm him. As an omega of pure bloodline from one of the most respected families in the clan, he had always known this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the intensity of it. His rare gift of healing had marked him as special from an early age, and the clan elders had often spoken of how blessed his future mate would be to bond with someone of such unique abilities. The ceremonial fires cast dancing shadows across the faces of the gathered wolves, and Lian could smell the mixture of excitement, fear, and desperate longing that permeated the crowd. His own family stood in places of honor near the sacred altar, their pride in him evident in their posture and the way they carried themselves. He was their brightest star, the sun who would elevate their status even further when he bonded with what they all expected would be a powerful alpha. At the center of the ceremony stood Kairos, the newly acknowledged heir to the clan leadership. Everything about him spoke of power and authority, from his imposing height to the way other wolves instinctively deferred to his presence. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and aristocratic features that spoke of generations of alpha bloodline. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known defeat, and his storm-gray eyes held the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. The clan's high shaman raised her staff, and the assembled wolves fell silent as one. Tonight, under the blessing of the full moon, the sacred bonds will be revealed. Let those called by fate step forward and claim what the goddess has decreed. Her voice carried across the grove with the authority of centuries, and Lian felt something deep inside his chest begin to sing, a recognition that went beyond conscious thought. The pull began as a whisper, then grew stronger with each heartbeat until it was like a golden thread tugging at his very soul. Lian looked across the ceremonial circle and saw Kairos's eyes widen with the same recognition, the same undeniable call of destiny that was drawing them together. The future alpha took a step forward, then another, and Lian found himself moving as well, drawn by forces older than civilization itself. They met in the center of the grove, the sacred space where countless generations had found their mates, and Lian could see the golden light of their bond beginning to manifest between them. It was beautiful, pure, everything the stories had promised it would be. Kairos reached for the ceremonial binding cloth that the shaman offered, the silk ribbon that would mark their acceptance of each other and seal their fate in front of the entire clan. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Lian extended his hand, palm up, waiting for Kairos to tie the binding cloth around their joined wrists in the ancient gesture of acceptance. He could see something flickering in the alpha's eyes, could smell the sudden shift in his scent from attraction to something darker, more conflicted. But surely that was just nervousness, the natural anxiety that came with such a momentous decision. Then Kairos's expression hardened into something cold and cruel, and instead of tying the cloth around their wrists, he tore it from Lian's extended hand with a violence that shocked the watching crowd into gasps of disbelief. "You are not my mate," Kairos declared, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent grove. "I will not bind myself to a creature that reeks of fear and weakness. An Omega, no matter how pure his bloodline, is not worthy to stand beside the future leader of this clan." The words hit Lian like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. Through the bond that had begun to form between them, he could feel Kairos's revulsion, his shame at being tied to someone the alpha saw as beneath him. The beautiful golden light that had connected them flickered and died as Kairos deliberately severed the connection, casting the torn pieces of the binding cloth to the ground at Lian's feet. The humiliation was complete and public, witnessed by every member of the clan including his own family. Lian stood frozen in the center of the circle, the tattered remnants of what should have been his binding cloth scattered around him like broken dreams. He could hear the whispers starting, See the way people who had once looked at him with respect now turned away in embarrassment or pity. Return to your place, the high shaman said, her voice gentle but carrying an undertone of disappointment that cut deep. The goddess works in mysterious ways, and perhaps this rejection serves a greater purpose we cannot yet understand. But Lian could see the truth in the eyes of those around him. There was no greater purpose to this humiliation, no divine plan that would make sense of his public rejection. He had been found wanting by his fated mate, and in werewolf society, that made him damaged goods, an omega who carried the taint of rejection like a scar that would never heal. The ceremony continued around him as if nothing had happened, other couples stepping forward to claim their bonds, while Lian stood alone in his shame. Karos accepted the congratulations of the clan elders with the same easy confidence he had always shown, unmarked by what he had just done, while Lian felt like he was drowning in the weight of hundreds of judging gazes. When the ceremony finally ended, Lian found himself surrounded by a void where his family's support should have been. They avoided his eyes, their own shame at his failure written clearly in their body language. His father, who had once spoken proudly of his gifted son to anyone who would listen, now looked at him as if he were a stranger. You have brought dishonor to our family name, his father said quietly, the words cutting deeper than any shouted condemnation could have. Your rejection reflects on all of us, calls into question the purity of our bloodline and the strength of our genetics. It wasn't my choice, Lian tried to explain, but his mother cut him off with a gesture that spoke of finality. It doesn't matter whose choice it was, she said, her voice cold with disappointment. The result is the same. You are damaged now, marked as unacceptable by your own fated mate. No other alpha will want you, and your presence here will only serve as a constant reminder of our family's failure. The conversation that followed was brief and brutal. They stripped him of the family name first, declaring that he was no longer worthy to carry the proud lineage that had served the clan for generations. Then came the practical matters, the revocation of his place in the family home, the withdrawal of financial support, the severing of all the ties that had once made him feel secure and loved. You have 3 days to gather your belongings and leave clan territory, his father informed him with the detached tone he might use to discuss the weather. After that, you will be considered a trespasser and dealt with accordingly. The next 3 days passed in a blur of packing and painful goodbyes. Some of his former friends tried to offer support, but it was clear that associating with him now carried social risks they weren't willing to take. Others avoided him entirely, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw him coming, as if his rejection might be contagious. On the final morning, Lian loaded his few remaining possessions into a travel pack and set out from the only home he had ever known. The guards at the territory boundary watched him leave with expressions that mixed pity with relief, clearly glad to see this reminder of failure and shame removed from their sight. He walked for hours without any clear destination in mind, following game trails and old roads that led away from the clan lands and into the wilderness beyond. The weight of his pack seemed to grow heavier with each step, not from its physical contents but from the crushing realization that he was truly alone in the world for the first time in his life. As the sun began to set on his first day as an exile, Lian found himself at the edge of the wild zone, the dangerous borderlands that separated the civilized territories from the ancient domains where older, more primal creatures still held sway. It was said that dragons still lived in these lands, beings of immense power and little patience for the mortals who occasionally stumbled into their domains. Lian should have been afraid, should have turned back and sought shelter in one of the neutral territories where exiles and outcasts could sometimes find refuge. Instead, he found himself stepping across the boundary markers, walking deeper into the wild zone as darkness fell around him. If he was going to die, better it be quickly at the claws of some ancient predator than slowly from starvation and despair in the civilized world that had rejected him. The forest was different here, older and wilder than anything in the clan territories. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the moonlight struggled to penetrate it. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, calls and cries from creatures that Lian couldn't identify, and the air itself seemed charged with a magic that made his skin tingle with awareness. He walked through the night, driven by some instinct he couldn't name, following paths that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. His healing gift, normally so controlled and precise, began to react to the wild magic around him, causing his hands to glow with a soft blue light that helped him navigate the treacherous terrain. It was near dawn when exhaustion finally caught up with him. Lian collapsed beside a stream that ran red with mineral deposits, his body finally giving in to the physical and emotional toll of the past few days. He managed to drink a little of the water, which tasted of iron and something else he couldn't identify, before unconsciousness claimed him. He dreamed of fire and shadow, of great wings blotting out the sun and eyes like molten gold that seemed to see straight through to his soul. A voice spoke to him in the dream, deep and resonant with the weight of centuries, but he couldn't quite make out the words. When he woke, the sun was high overhead and he was no longer alone. The dragon stood over him in its humanoid form, tall and imposing with features that were beautiful in an otherworldly way. His skin had a subtle scaled pattern that caught the light like armor, and his hair was the color of dark flame. When he smiled, Lian caught a glimpse of teeth that were just slightly too sharp, a reminder that beneath the elegant exterior lay something far more dangerous than any werewolf alpha. Well, the dragon said, his voice carrying the same resonant quality from Lian's dreams. What have we here? A little lost wolf, far from his pack and smelling of rejection and despair. He crouched down beside Lian, close enough that the Omega could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Tell me, little wolf, what brings you to my domain? I have nowhere else to go, Lian managed to say, his voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. My clan cast me out. Ah. The dragon's golden eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement or hunger. Cast out, were you? How deliciously tragic. And what crime did you commit to earn such punishment? I was rejected by my fated mate, Lian said, the words still tasting like ashes in his mouth. He found me unworthy, the dragon laughed, a sound like distant thunder that seemed to rumble through the very ground beneath them. Rejected by a werewolf? How utterly predictable. Your kind has always been so concerned with appearances and social standing. He stood and extended a hand to help Lian to his feet. I am Varein, Lord of the Dark Ridge, and you, little wolf, are now on my territory. Are you going to kill me? Lian asked, too exhausted to feel proper fear. Kill you? Varein seemed genuinely surprised by the question. How wasteful that would be. No, I think I'll keep you instead. At least until I decide whether you're more useful alive or dead. His smile was sharp and predatory. Consider yourself my newest acquisition. What followed was unlike anything Lian had expected. Instead of the dungeon or cage he had anticipated, Varein led him to a fortress carved into the living rock of the mountain itself. The architecture was breathtaking, all soaring spires and elegant curves that seemed to flow like frozen flame. Inside, the halls were lit by crystals that glowed with their own inner fire, and the rooms were furnished with treasures that would have made kings weep with envy. Your quarters, Varein said, showing him to a suite of rooms that were larger and more luxurious than anything Lian had ever seen. You'll find clothes in the wardrobe and a bath drawn for your use. Clean yourself up, and then we'll discuss your duties. The duties, as it turned out, were surprisingly mundane. Varein expected him to maintain the fortress, to serve meals and tend to correspondence, to be a silent and efficient presence who could anticipate the dragon's needs without being asked. It was menial work, but it was work, and it gave Lian a purpose that helped distract him from the pain of his rejection. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Lian settled into a routine that was both comforting and numbing, losing himself in the repetitive tasks that kept the ancient fortress running smoothly. He learned to navigate Varein's moods, to recognize when the dragon wanted company for conversation, and when he preferred to be left alone with his books and artifacts. The dragon was a contradiction in many ways, capable of casual cruelty one moment and unexpected kindness the next. He never struck Lian or threatened him with physical harm, but his words could cut like blades when he was displeased. Yet there were also moments when he showed genuine consideration, ensuring that Lian had warm clothes for the mountain cold or setting aside books he thought might interest him. It was during one of the harsh winter storms that swept through the mountains that their relationship began to shift into something deeper. Lian had been tending to the great fireplace in Varein's study when he noticed the dragon watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You never cry," Varein observed, his golden eyes reflecting the firelight. "I've seen many broken creatures pass through my domain over the centuries, and they all cry eventually. But not you. Crying won't change anything," Lian replied, continuing to arrange the logs with practiced efficiency. "My mate rejected me, my family disowned me, and my old life is gone forever. Tears won't bring any of that back." "But it must hurt," Varein pressed, leaning forward in his chair with genuine curiosity. "The rejection, the abandonment, the loss of everything you once held dear. How do you bear it without breaking?" Lian paused in his work, considering the question seriously. "I suppose I've learned that breaking is a choice. I can choose to let their rejection define me, or I can choose to define myself." He looked up at Varein, meeting those golden eyes directly. "I choose not to break." Something shifted in Varein's expression at those words, a flicker of something that might have been respect or admiration. "Interesting," he murmured, settling back in his chair. "Most creatures would have shattered under far less pressure. Perhaps there's more to you than I initially thought, little wolf." From that night forward, their interactions took on a different quality. Varein began asking for Lian's opinions on matters of estate management, seeking his input on decisions that affected the running of the fortress. He started sharing stories of his long life, tales of ancient battles and lost civilizations that painted a picture of a being who had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon the shore. Lian found himself looking forward to these conversations, treasuring the moments when Varein treated him as more than just a servant. The dragon's intelligence was vast and complex, shaped by centuries of experience and observation, and his perspectives on the world were unlike anything Lian had ever encountered. It was spring when they found the boy. Lian had been gathering herbs in the forest when he heard the crying, a sound so full of fear and despair that it cut through him like a blade. Following the sound, he discovered a child huddled in a hollow tree, no more than 7 or 8 years old, with the distinctive features of a mixed heritage. The boy's scent carried traces of multiple bloodlines, marking him as one of the hybrid children who were often abandoned by families that couldn't accept their mixed nature. "Hey there," Lian said softly, crouching down to the child's level. "What's your name?" "Milo," the boy whispered, looking up at him with eyes that were far too old for his young face. "Are you going to hurt me too?" "No," Lian said firmly, his heart breaking at the question. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you can't stay out here alone. It's dangerous." The story came out in fragments as Lian cleaned the boy's wounds and coaxed him to eat some of the food from his gathering basket. Milo was the child of a union between a werewolf and a nature sprite, his dual heritage making him an outcast in both communities. His werewolf father had abandoned his sprite mother when he learned of her pregnancy, and the sprite community had driven them both out when Milo's mixed nature became apparent. "Mama got sick," Milo explained, tears streaming down his dirty cheeks. "She said the sadness was eating her from inside, and then one morning she just faded away, like morning mist when the sun gets too bright." Lian felt something fierce and protective awaken in his chest as he looked at this abandoned child. Here was another casualty of the rigid prejudices that governed their world, another innocent soul cast aside for circumstances beyond his control. "Come with me," he said, making a decision that he knew would change everything. "I know someone who might be willing to help." Leading Milo back to the fortress, Lian's mind raced with arguments he could make to convince Varein to let the boy stay. The dragon was not known for his compassion toward random strays, and Lian had no right to make such requests. But something about the child's plight had awakened every protective instinct he possessed. He found Varein in his private chambers, reviewing correspondence from various contacts throughout the magical world. The dragon looked up as they entered, his golden eyes taking in the boy's appearance with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a potential threat or asset. "What is this?" Varein asked, his tone neutral but carrying an undertone of displeasure at having his privacy invaded. "His name is Milo," Lian said, his hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. "He's lost his mother and has nowhere to go. I was hoping you might allow him to stay, at least temporarily." "Allow him to stay?" Varein's eyebrows rose in surprise. "This is not a sanctuary for abandoned children, little wolf. I have no use for crying infants who will only create mess and noise." "He won't be any trouble," Lian insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'll take full responsibility for him. He can help with my duties, and I'll make sure he doesn't interfere with your work." Varein studied them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Lian held his breath, knowing that the dragon's next words would determine not just Milo's fate, but possibly his own. If Varein refused, Lian wasn't sure he could simply abandon the child to die in the wilderness. "You would risk my displeasure for the sake of a stranger's child?" Varein asked, genuine curiosity coloring his tone. "I would risk anything to save an innocent life," Lian replied without hesitation. "He's just a boy who's lost everything through no fault of his own. Surely that deserves compassion, not abandonment." Something flickered in Varein's golden eyes, an emotion too quick to identify but profound enough to change his entire expression. "Very well," he said finally. "The child may stay, but he is your responsibility entirely. If he causes any disruption to my household, both of you will answer for it." "Thank you," Lian breathed, relief flooding through him so intensely that his knees nearly buckled. "You won't regret this, I promise." "See that I don't," Varein replied, but there was something almost gentle in his tone that belied the harsh words. The integration of Milo into their strange household brought changes that none of them had anticipated. The boy was quiet and well-behaved, grateful for the safety and stability that the fortress provided, but his presence added a warmth and energy that had been missing before. He followed Lian around like a devoted shadow, eager to help with whatever tasks needed doing and hungry for the attention and care that he had been denied for so long. More surprisingly, Varein seemed to develop a genuine fondness for the child. The ancient dragon, who claimed to have no patience for mortal concerns, could often be found teaching Milo to read the old scripts or explaining the properties of various magical artifacts. When the boy had nightmares, it was Varein who would appear at his bedside with stories of distant lands and ancient heroes that could chase away the darkest dreams. "You're good with him," Lian observed one evening as they watched Milo practice his letters at the great table in the main hall. "Children are surprisingly resilient," Varein replied, but there was a softness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "They adapt to new circumstances far more easily than adults, and they accept affection without the complicated emotional baggage that comes with experience." "Is that why you let him stay?" Lian asked. "Because he's adaptable?" Varein was quiet for a long moment, watching as Milo carefully formed each letter with intense concentration. "I let him stay," he said finally, "because you asked me to, and because I've discovered that I'm curious to see what kind of man you'll help him become." The words sent a warm flutter through Lian's chest, a recognition that their relationship had evolved far beyond that of master and servant. There was something building between them, something that went deeper than mere companionship or convenience, though neither of them had yet found the courage to name it. That courage came during the autumn storms, when the mountain passes were blocked by snow and the three of them were effectively cut off from the outside world. Milo had fallen ill with a fever that no amount of conventional healing could touch, and Lian had spent 3 days and nights at his bedside, pouring his healing gift into the boy's small body with an intensity that left him exhausted and drained. On the third night, when Milo's fever finally broke and his breathing eased into natural sleep, Lian collapsed in the chair beside the bed. He had pushed himself beyond his limits, given everything he had to save the child, and now he could barely keep his eyes open. He woke hours later to find himself covered with a warm blanket, with Varein sitting in another chair nearby. The dragon was reading by the light of a small crystal, but his attention was clearly focused on Lian rather than the book in his hands. "How long have you been here?" Lian asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Since you fell asleep," Varein replied, setting the book aside. I wanted to make sure you were all right. You pushed yourself very hard these past few days. He needed me, Lian said simply, looking over at Milo's peacefully sleeping form. I couldn't let him suffer when I had the power to help. Even at the cost of your own health? Varein asked, and there was something intense in his golden eyes that made Lian's heart skip a beat. Especially at the cost of my own health, Lian replied. That's what love means, isn't it? Being willing to sacrifice for those who matter to you. Love. Varein repeated the word as if testing its weight and meaning. Such a dangerous concept, especially for creatures like us who have learned to value self-preservation above all else. Is it dangerous? Lian asked, leaning forward in his chair despite his exhaustion. Or is it the most honest thing we can offer each other? Instead of answering directly, Varein reached out and touched Lian's face with surprising gentleness, his fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion and stress that marked the Omega's features. You have eyes like fire that never dies, he said softly. It's dangerous, you know, because it makes me want to keep you beside me forever. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and possibilities that neither of them had dared to voice before. Lian felt his breath catch as he realized what Varein was offering, what the dragon was risking by revealing his feelings so openly. Then keep me, Lian whispered, covering Varein's hand with his own. Not as a servant or a curiosity, but as someone who chooses to be here, as someone who loves you. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, as if neither of them could quite believe that this was really happening. But when Lian responded eagerly, pressing closer and opening his mouth under Varein's, the dragon deepened it with a passion that spoke of desires long held in check. They made love that night with a tenderness that transformed them both, Varein worshipping Lian's body with a reverence that made the Omega feel cherished and desired in ways he had never imagined possible. Through their joining, Lian felt something broken inside himself begin to heal, the wounds left by his rejection and abandonment slowly closing under the warmth of genuine love and acceptance. Mine, Varein whispered against his throat as they moved together in perfect rhythm. My heart, my choice, my beloved. Yours? Lian agreed, arching beneath him as pleasure built to impossible heights. Always yours, for as long as you'll have me. In the morning, they woke wrapped around each other like they had been made to fit together, and Lian felt a peace he had never known before. This wasn't the desperate pull of a fated bond imposed by genetics and social expectations, but something they had chosen freely, something that belonged entirely to them. Their happiness was interrupted by news that would test everything they had built together. A messenger arrived bearing word that the werewolf clans were mobilizing for war against the dragon territories, claiming that the ancient beings posed a threat to the stability of the region. At the head of this coalition was Karos, now fully established as the leader of the Silver Mountain clan and hungry for the glory that a successful campaign would bring. He doesn't know I'm here, Lian said as they discussed the implications in Varein's study. As far as the clan is concerned, I died in exile years ago. But you're not dead, Varein pointed out, his golden eyes blazing with protective fury. You're here with me, building a life that has nothing to do with their petty politics and territorial disputes. A life they'll try to destroy if they attack the ridge, Lian said, fear creeping into his voice as he imagined losing everything they had built together. We have to do something. We could fight, Varein suggested, his tone suggesting that he would relish the opportunity to demonstrate his power against those who threatened his family. I have allies among the dragon courts, and my own magic is more than sufficient to repel any werewolf attack. Or, Lian said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind, I could reveal myself, show them that their assumptions about dragons and those who live with them are wrong. Absolutely not, Varein said immediately, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. I won't have you exposing yourself to their judgment and potential violence just to save my territory. It's not just your territory anymore, Lian reminded him gently. It's our home, Milo's home, and if there's a chance that my testimony could prevent a war that would destroy everything we've built, don't I have an obligation to try? The debate continued for hours, with Varein arguing passionately against any plan that would put Lian at risk and Lian insisting that he couldn't hide while others made decisions that would affect their family's future. In the end, it was Milo who provided the deciding argument. "If the war comes here," the boy said with the simple wisdom that children sometimes possessed, "people will get hurt. Good people who don't deserve to suffer because adults can't talk to each other like civilized beings." He looked up at both of his guardians with serious eyes. "Lian taught me that when you have the power to help, you have the responsibility to try." So it was that Lian found himself standing before the Council of Clans for the first time in years. No longer the broken exile who had fled into the wilderness, but a confident man who had found his place in the world. The Great Hall was packed with representatives from dozens of werewolf communities, all eager to see this mystery witness who claimed to have vital information about the dragon threat. The reaction when he revealed his identity was everything he had expected and more. Gasps of shock rippled through the assembled crowd, followed by angry murmurs as people recognized the Omega who had once brought such shame to the Silver Mountain clan. Karos looked like he had seen a ghost, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been guilt in rapid succession. "Lian," Karos said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "You're supposed to be dead." "Disappointed?" Lian asked, his tone light but carrying an edge that made several council members shift uncomfortably. "Sorry to inconvenience you with my continued existence." "What are you doing here?" Karos demanded, rising from his place among the clan leaders. "This council has no business with exiles and outcasts. This council is preparing to make war on the dragon territories," Lian replied calmly. "Since I've spent the last several years living in those territories, I thought my perspective might be valuable before you commit to a course of action that could cost many lives." "Living with dragons?" One of the elder counselors leaned forward with obvious disgust. "What manner of creature would willingly consort with those ancient monsters? The same manner of creature who was cast out by his own people for the crime of being rejected," Lian said, his voice carrying a strength that surprised even himself. "I went into the wild zone expecting to die, and instead I found a new family, a new purpose, and a love more genuine than anything I ever experienced among the clans." "Love?" Karos's voice was sharp with disbelief and something that might have been jealousy. "You claim to love a dragon?" "I claim to love a being who saw value in me when my own fated mate cast me aside like garbage," Lian replied, meeting Karos's gaze directly without flinching. "A being who offered me shelter when my own family disowned me, who accepted my choices without trying to change who I am." The murmurs in the hall grew louder, a mix of scandal and curiosity as the assembled werewolves tried to process this revelation. Several of the younger clan members looked intrigued rather than disgusted, as if Lian's story had touched something in their own experiences with rejection and judgment. "The dragons are not the monsters you believe them to be," Lian continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "They are ancient beings with their own culture, their own values, their own capacity for love and loyalty. The one I live with has shown more honor and kindness than I ever received from my own people." "Pretty words," Karos said dismissively, though Lian could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "But they don't change what dragons are. Predators, creatures of greed and violence who see mortals as nothing more than prey or entertainment. Is that what you see when you look at me?" Lian asked, spreading his arms wide so that the entire council could observe him clearly. "Do I look like prey to you? Like someone who has been brutalized or enslaved?" He gestured to his fine clothes, his healthy appearance, the confidence in his bearing. "I am here of my own free will, speaking to you as an equal, because I choose to try to prevent a war that would serve no one's interests." "You speak of choice," one of the elder women said, her voice thoughtful rather than accusatory. "But how can we trust that your choices are truly your own? Dragon magic is subtle and powerful. Perhaps you believe you love this creature because you have been enchanted or coerced. Perhaps," Lian acknowledged, "or perhaps I love him because he earned that love through his actions, because he protects those weaker than himself, because he values knowledge and beauty, because he treats me as an equal partner rather than a possession to be owned." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final argument. Tell me, counselors, which sounds more like magic to you? Love that grows from mutual respect and shared experiences, or the bonds of genetics that declare two incompatible people must be mates simply because of their biology? The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the shifting and murmuring of people uncomfortable with having their fundamental beliefs questioned so directly. Lian could see that his words had hit their mark, that at least some of the assembled werewolves were beginning to question their assumptions about dragons and the nature of love itself. It was Kairos who broke the silence, his voice heavy with years of regret that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. I made a mistake, he said, the admission clearly costing him tremendous effort. When I rejected our bond, I told myself it was for the good of the clan, that an alpha needed a mate who would make him appear strong and decisive. He looked directly at Lian, his storm-gray eyes filled with pain. But the truth is that I was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of being seen as weak, afraid of loving someone who might see through the image I worked so hard to maintain. I know, Lian said gently, his anger toward his former mate having long since transformed into something closer to pity. I could see it in your eyes that night, could smell the fear underneath all that certainty. But Kairos, fear of love isn't strength. It's the most destructive weakness of all. I realize that now, Kairos replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Watching you stand here, confident and happy and clearly loved, I can see what my rejection cost both of us. You found with your dragon what I was too much of a coward to offer you. Yes, I did, Lian said simply. And that's why this war cannot happen. Because there are others out there like me, like you, like all of us, who deserve the chance to find love and acceptance wherever it may be offered. The dragons are not our enemies unless we make them so. The debate that followed was heated but civilized, with clan representatives arguing the merits of war versus diplomacy, tradition versus change. In the end, it was the younger generation that tipped the scales, werewolves who had grown up hearing stories of the old hatreds, but who were more interested in building a future than relitigating the past. The final vote was closer than Lian had hoped but decisive enough to matter. The war was called off, replaced by a tentative agreement to pursue diplomatic contact with the dragon territories. It wasn't perfect, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, but it was a beginning. As the council session ended and the various clan representatives began to disperse, Kairos approached Lian one last time. I want you to know, he said quietly, that seeing you happy means more to me than you might imagine. I destroyed what we could have had together, but knowing that you found something better, it helps me believe that maybe I can learn to make better choices in the future. You can, Lian assured him, his voice warm with genuine compassion. But first you have to stop being afraid of your own heart. The journey back to the Dark Ridge was quiet, with Lian lost in thought about everything that had happened and what it might mean for their future. Varein had been waiting at the fortress when he returned, pacing the great hall like a caged predator until Lian walked through the doors safe and sound. How did it go? Varein asked, sweeping Lian into an embrace that spoke of hours of worry and fear. Better than I hoped, Lian replied, breathing in the familiar scent of fire and ancient magic that always calmed his nerves. The war has been called off, at least for now. And the cost of this victory? Varein asked, his golden eyes searching Lian's face for signs of damage or distress. Some painful memories revisited, some old wounds aired in public, Lian said honestly. But nothing I couldn't handle, and nothing that changed how I feel about the life we've built here. Good, Varein said, his relief evident in every line of his body. Because I've been thinking while you were gone, and I've reached some conclusions about our future. Before Lian could ask what he meant, Varein dropped to one knee in the ancient gesture of proposal, producing a ring that seemed to be carved from a single piece of dragonfire opal. Lian, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. You are the only being I have ever wanted to hold, not for power or possession, but simply for the joy of having you near. Will you do me the honor of becoming my mate in the eyes of both our peoples? The tears that came this time were tears of joy, the culmination of a journey that had begun with rejection and abandonment, but had led to something more beautiful than anything Lian had ever dared to imagine. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Their wedding was a small affair, attended by the few dragons who had become their friends over the years and witnessed by Milo, who had appointed himself the official keeper of their happiness. The ceremony combined traditions from both their cultures, creating something new and uniquely theirs. Years passed, and their little family grew in ways that surprised them all. Milo developed into a confident young man whose mixed heritage became a bridge between different communities rather than a source of shame. He learned magic from Varein and healing from Lian, but more importantly, he learned that love could create families just as strong as blood ever had. Other outcasts found their way to the Dark Ridge over time, drawn by stories of acceptance and belonging that spread through the underground networks that connected the dispossessed and abandoned. What had started as a fortress became a community, a place where differences were celebrated rather than condemned. On quiet evenings, Lian would often find himself standing on the battlements overlooking the valley below, marveling at the life they had built together. The boy who had been cast out for being unworthy had become a leader, a healer, a husband, and a father. The dragon who had lived in isolation for centuries had become the heart of a community built on love and acceptance. "Any regrets?" Varein would ask, coming up behind him to wrap strong arms around his waist and rest his chin on Lian's shoulder. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," Lian would reply, leaning back into the familiar warmth and strength of his mate's embrace. "But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps we needed to become who we were meant to be before we could recognize our true home." "And what is our true home?" Varein would ask, though he knew the answer as well as Lian did. "Here," Lian would say, turning in his arms to look up into those beloved golden eyes. "Wherever we choose to build it together." Their love story had no ending because the best stories never do. They continue to unfold day by day, choice by choice, love by love, proving that rejection and abandonment are not the end of the story, but sometimes the beginning of something far more beautiful than anything that came before. In a world that often valued tradition over happiness and conformity over love, they had created something revolutionary simply by choosing each other and refusing to let anyone else define their worth. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference. The first real test of their new community came 3 years after their wedding, when a delegation of young dragons arrived at the Dark Ridge seeking sanctuary. They were led by Zephyr, a dragon barely past his majority who bore the scars of exile from his own court for the crime of falling in love with a phoenix rather than choosing a mate from among his own kind. "We heard there was a place here where love was valued over tradition," Zephyr said as he stood before Lian and Varein in the Great Hall, his silver-blue scales dulled with exhaustion and despair. "Where beings could be with their chosen mates regardless of species or social expectations." Behind him stood 5 other young dragons, each carrying their own story of rejection and exile. There was Ember, whose crime had been refusing an arranged mating with a politically advantageous partner. Sage, who had been cast out for his scholarly pursuits rather than the martial traditions his clan expected. And Frost, whose quiet nature and love of healing arts had been deemed unsuitable for a creature expected to embody draconic pride and aggression. "There is such a place," Varein said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute commitment. "But sanctuary here requires more than just need. It requires a willingness to contribute to something larger than yourself, to help build a community based on mutual respect and support." "We understand," Zephyr replied, his golden eyes bright with hope. "We've lost our birth families, our traditional status, everything we once thought defined us. But we're willing to work, to learn, to become part of whatever you're building here." Lian felt his heart swell with pride as he watched Varein welcome the young dragons with the same mixture of caution and compassion that had once been extended to him. The community they had built was growing, evolving into something that transcended their original vision of a simple refuge for outcasts. The integration of the new arrivals brought fresh energy and perspectives to the Dark Ridge. Ember proved to have a talent for organization that transformed their record-keeping and supply management. Sage established a library and research center that drew scholars from across the magical world. Frost worked alongside Lian in the healing center they had established, his gentle nature perfect for treating the physical and emotional wounds of those who sought their help. But it was Zephyr who brought the most significant change to their community. His phoenix mate, Azure, had followed him into exile despite the danger it posed to both of them. The phoenix was a being of living flame and light, beautiful beyond description but struggling with the constant fear that their love would bring destruction to those around them. "My kind are not meant for close relationships," Azure confided to Lian during one of their private conversations. "We burn too bright, feel too intensely. Every emotion becomes a conflagration that threatens to consume everything in its path." "But love isn't meant to be contained or controlled," Lian replied, drawing on his own hard-won wisdom about the nature of true partnership. "It's meant to be shared, to grow stronger through connection rather than isolation." "How do you do it?" Azure asked, genuine curiosity coloring their musical voice. "How do you maintain such a strong bond with Varein without losing yourself in the process?" "By remembering that love isn't about becoming the same person," Lian said thoughtfully. "It's about choosing to support each other's growth, to celebrate each other's strengths, and to help heal each other's wounds. Varein doesn't try to change my essential nature, and I don't try to diminish his. We've learned to be ourselves more fully because we know we're accepted completely." The conversation sparked an idea that would transform not just Azure and Zephyr's relationship, but the entire approach their community took to helping couples navigate the challenges of interspecies bonding. Lian began developing what he called harmony sessions, gatherings where mixed couples could share their experiences and learn from each other's successes and struggles. The sessions quickly became one of the most popular and effective programs at the Dark Ridge. Couples would arrive from across the magical world, some barely holding their relationships together, others seeking to strengthen already solid bonds. Under Lian's guidance, they learned techniques for bridging cultural differences, managing conflicting instincts, and building communication patterns that honored both partners' natures. Varein watched these developments with a mixture of pride and amazement. "You've become something I never expected when I first found you by that stream," he told Lian one evening as they walked through the gardens that now surrounded their fortress. "What did you expect?" Lian asked, genuinely curious about his mate's early impressions. "A broken creature who would provide temporary entertainment before inevitably disappointing me," Varein admitted with characteristic honesty. "I had no concept that you would heal not just yourself, but me, and eventually dozens of others who found their way to us." "We healed each other," Lian corrected, stopping to turn and face his husband. "And we're still healing, still growing, still becoming more than we were alone." Their conversation was interrupted by Milo, now a young man of 17 with the confidence and wisdom that came from growing up surrounded by love and acceptance. "Lian, Varein," he called, jogging up to them with excitement evident in every line of his body. "You need to see this." He led them to the main courtyard where a crowd had gathered around a new arrival. The visitor was unlike anyone they had seen before, a being whose very presence seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which he was viewed. Sometimes he appeared human, sometimes elven, occasionally showing traces of dragon or phoenix, or any number of other magical lineages. "I am called Kalos," the being said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple vocal cords working in concert. "I am what happens when the barriers between species break down completely, when love transcends not just individual prejudices but the very concept of fixed identity." He explained that he was the result of a magical experiment gone wrong, or perhaps gone exactly right depending on one's perspective. Born from the union of parents who were themselves the products of multiple mixed heritage lines, he had developed the ability to shift between different aspects of his ancestry at will. "Most communities see me as an abomination," Kalos continued, his form flickering between appearances like a living kaleidoscope, "a creature that represents the breakdown of natural order, the corruption of pure bloodlines. But I've heard that this place values diversity over purity, love over tradition." "It does," Lian said immediately, stepping forward to welcome this newest refugee. But tell us, what brings you here specifically? What are you seeking that you haven't found elsewhere? Kalos's form stabilized into something roughly humanoid but still indefinably other. Understanding, he said simply. For all my life, I've been told that I'm impossible, that beings like me shouldn't exist. I want to understand what I am, what I represent, and whether there's a place in the world for creatures who embody change itself. The arrival of Kalos marked a new phase in the Dark Ridge community's evolution. His presence challenged even their expanded concepts of identity and belonging, forcing them to grapple with questions about the nature of self and the boundaries of acceptance. Some of the newer residents struggled with Kalos's fluid nature, finding his constant shifting unsettling or threatening to their own sense of identity. But Lian and Varein stood firm in their commitment to inclusion, working patiently with both Kalos and the community to find ways for everyone to coexist comfortably. Change is the only constant in the universe, Varein observed during one of their evening discussions. Perhaps Kalos represents the future of our world, a time when the rigid categories that divide us will become meaningless. Or perhaps he represents something even more fundamental, Lian replied thoughtfully. The idea that identity itself is a choice, something we create rather than something we're born with. The philosophy behind these discussions began to influence the community's approach to everything from education to governance. They established councils where decisions were made through consensus rather than hierarchy, where every voice was valued regardless of the speaker's species, age, or background. Milo emerged as a natural leader in these new structures, his mixed heritage and upbringing in the community making him uniquely suited to bridge different perspectives and find common ground. Watching him facilitate discussions between dragons and phoenixes, sprites and werewolves, selkies and elementals, Lian felt a profound sense of satisfaction in the man his adopted son had become. You raised him well, Azure told Lian after observing one particularly challenging negotiation that Milo had guided to a successful resolution. He has your compassion, but with a strength that's entirely his own. He raised himself in many ways, Lian replied, though he couldn't hide his pride. Varein and I just provided the environment where he could grow into who he was meant to be. The success of their community began to attract attention from official sources, not all of it positive. Representatives from various governments and magical courts arrived with increasing frequency, some seeking to understand their methods, others clearly looking for reasons to shut them down. The most challenging visit came from a delegation representing the High Council of Magical Beings, the ancient governing body that oversaw interactions between the various magical species. Led by Archon Valdris, a phoenix of immense age and traditional views, the delegation arrived with obvious skepticism about what they termed experimental social structures. You've created an interesting curiosity here, Valdris said as he toured their facilities, his words carrying the dismissive tone of someone who viewed their work as a temporary aberration. But surely you must see that this level of integration is unsustainable in the long term. Different species have different needs, different natures. Attempting to force them together will inevitably lead to conflict and disappointment. We're not forcing anyone together, Lian replied calmly, though he could feel Varein's protective instincts stirring beside him. We're simply providing a space where those who choose to build bridges can do so safely and with support. Choice. Valdris repeated the word with obvious distaste. Such a modern concept. In my day, we understood that some choices were wiser than others, that tradition existed for good reasons. And what reasons were those? Varein asked, his voice carrying undertones of challenge that made several delegation members step back nervously. Stability, Valdris replied without hesitation. Predictability. The maintenance of social order and natural hierarchies that have served our peoples well for millennia. At what cost? Milo interjected, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had never known anything but acceptance. How many lives have been destroyed in the name of maintaining those hierarchies? How much potential has been wasted because it didn't fit into predetermined categories? The debate that followed was intense but civil, with members of the delegation challenging various aspects of the community while residents defended their choices and achievements. What emerged was not a victory for either side, but a deeper understanding of the philosophical differences that divided their approaches to governance and social organization. In the end, Valdris made a surprising admission. "I came here expecting to find chaos and dysfunction," he said as the delegation prepared to leave. "Instead, I find a level of cooperation and mutual support that is genuinely impressive, even if I question its long-term viability. Perhaps that's because you're looking at it through the lens of traditional power structures," Lian suggested gently. "We're not trying to replicate existing systems. We're trying to create something entirely new, based on principles that prioritize individual fulfillment over institutional stability. Time will tell which approach proves more sustainable," Valdris replied, but there was less certainty in his voice than there had been when he arrived. The validation from official sources, even grudging validation, brought new opportunities and challenges to the Dark Ridge. Funding offers arrived from progressive organizations wanting to support their work. Researchers requested permission to study their methods and outcomes. Most importantly, a steady stream of visitors came seeking to learn and potentially replicate their approach in other locations. Among these visitors was someone Lian had never expected to see again. Kairos arrived one autumn evening, alone and bearing none of the ceremonial trappings of his position as clan leader. He looked older than his years, worn down by the responsibilities of leadership, and what Lian could sense were deep personal regrets. "I didn't come to disrupt anything," Kairos said immediately when Lian greeted him at the gates. "I just wanted to see for myself what you've built here, to understand how you've managed to create something so different from everything we were taught was possible." "You're welcome here," Lian said, meaning it despite their complicated history. "Though I should warn you that our community has evolved far beyond what you might remember from the council meetings." The tour that followed was both painful and illuminating for Kairos. He saw couples who had found love across species lines that werewolf tradition declared impossible. He witnessed children growing up without the rigid gender roles and social expectations that had defined his own upbringing. Most challengingly, he observed the deep contentment and joy that characterized the relationships around him, including the obvious love between Lian and Varein. "I keep thinking about what might have been," Kairos confided to Lian during a private conversation on their second evening. "If I had been brave enough to accept our bond, if I had prioritized love over social expectations." "Regret is a poison that destroys the present as well as the past," Lian replied, drawing on wisdom he had gained through years of healing work. "The question isn't what might have been, but what you're going to do with the knowledge you have now." "What do you mean?" Kairos asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "I mean that you're still young enough to make different choices," Lian said gently. "You're still capable of learning to value authenticity over appearances, love over duty. The fact that you came here suggests you're already starting that process." The conversation marked the beginning of a transformation for Kairos that would take years to complete but which started during his week-long stay at the Dark Ridge. He observed their governance structures, participated in community discussions, and slowly began to question assumptions about leadership and social organization that he had never examined before. "Your people respect you because you earn that respect daily," he observed to Lian near the end of his visit. "Not because of your bloodline or your position, but because of your actions and the choices you make. Respect that has to be earned is the only kind worth having," Lian replied. "Authority that depends on tradition or force is always fragile, always vulnerable to being challenged by someone stronger or more cunning." When Kairos finally departed, he carried with him not just new ideas about leadership but a commitment to implementing changes in his own clan. The letters that arrived over the following months described a gradual transformation of Silver Mountain policies, with increased tolerance for non-traditional relationships and greater emphasis on individual choice in matters of mating and career. The ripple effects of their work continued to spread far beyond what Lian and Varein had ever imagined possible. Other communities began experimenting with their methods, adapting the principles of acceptance and choice to fit different cultural contexts. Academic institutions started offering courses on interspecies relations based on research conducted at the Dark Ridge. Most significantly, a network began to emerge connecting various progressive communities and organizations committed to social transformation. The Dark Ridge became a hub in this network, hosting conferences and facilitating communication between groups working towards similar goals across the magical world. We've become something neither of us anticipated, Varein observed as they prepared for one such conference, their 5th annual gathering of alternative community leaders. Have we? Lian asked, pausing in his review of presentation materials. Or have we become exactly what we were meant to be, just in ways we never could have predicted? The conference itself was a testament to how much their world was changing. Representatives from dozens of communities shared stories of successful integration projects, innovative governance structures, and breakthrough techniques for resolving interspecies conflicts. The energy in the Great Hall was electric with possibility and hope. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the closing ceremony, when Milo stood before the assembled leaders to deliver a speech about the future of magical society. Now 25 and recognized as one of the most innovative thinkers of his generation, he embodied the potential that emerged when beings were allowed to develop without the constraints of traditional expectations. "We are the children of change," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Born from love that transcended boundaries, raised in communities that valued potential over pedigree. We represent not just what's possible, but what's inevitable as our world continues to evolve." He spoke about a future where the rigid categories that had divided magical beings for millennia would become as obsolete as the ancient prejudices they had fought to overcome, where love would be celebrated regardless of the forms it took, where families would be defined by choice rather than blood, where communities would be built on shared values rather than shared species. "The work you're doing here, in all your communities, isn't just about helping individual couples or families," Milo continued. "It's about reshaping the fundamental structures of our society, creating space for new forms of connection and belonging that our ancestors never imagined." As the conference ended and the various delegates prepared to return to their own communities, Lian felt a profound sense of completion mixed with anticipation for what was yet to come. The scared, rejected Omega who had stumbled into the wild zone expecting to die had become something he never could have imagined. A catalyst for social transformation on a scale that affected thousands of lives. "Any regrets about the quiet life we thought we were building?" Varein asked as they stood together on the battlements, watching the last of the departing delegates disappear into the distance. "None," Lian said immediately. "Though I have to admit, when you first offered me shelter in exchange for secretarial work, I never imagined it would lead to this." "Nor did I," Varein admitted, pulling Lian close against his side. "But perhaps that's the beauty of love, the way it expands beyond anything we thought we wanted or needed until we find ourselves living lives we never dared to dream." Their embrace was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps as Kalos approached, his form currently stabilized in a configuration that seemed to draw elements from every species they had ever welcomed to the ridge. "Lian Varein," he called breathlessly. "You need to see this. We've just received word from the High Council. They're formally recognizing the Dark Ridge as an autonomous territory with the right to set its own laws and policies regarding interspecies relations." The news was staggering in its implications. Official recognition meant protection from interference by hostile governments, the right to issue citizenship documents to refugees, and most importantly, legitimacy for their methods and philosophy. "How did this happen?" Lian asked, still processing the magnitude of what Kalos was telling them. "Apparently, Archon Valdris submitted a report recommending recognition," Kalos explained, his excitement causing his form to flicker rapidly between configurations. "He wrote that while he personally disagreed with many of our approaches, the measurable outcomes in terms of individual fulfillment and social stability were too significant to ignore." The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with the entire community gathering to acknowledge this milestone in their evolution from refugee camp to recognized nation. But for Lian and Varein, the most meaningful moment came when they found themselves alone in their private chambers, finally able to process the full significance of what had occurred. "We've done it," Lian said softly, hardly able to believe it himself. "We've actually created something that will outlast us. Something that can protect and nurture future generations of beings who don't fit into traditional categories." "We've done more than that," Varein replied, his golden eyes bright with emotion. We've proven that love really can change the world. One heart at a time, one choice at a time, one family at a time. As they settled into bed that night, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for so many years, Lian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the ashes of rejection and abandonment, they had built not just a love story but a legacy that would continue to grow and inspire long after they were gone. The boy who had been deemed unworthy had become a leader whose influence reached across the magical world. The dragon who had lived in isolation had become the cornerstone of a community that redefined what family and belonging could mean. And together, they had proven that the most powerful magic of all was the simple choice to love without limits, to accept without conditions, and to build something beautiful from whatever materials life provided. Their story would continue, as all the best love stories do, not because it had reached a perfect ending, but because it had become something larger than itself, a source of hope and inspiration for anyone who had ever felt rejected, abandoned, or told that they didn't belong. In a world that often seemed determined to divide people into categories of worthy and unworthy, acceptable and aberrant, they had created a space where the only category that mattered was the simple fact of being willing to love and be loved in return. And in the end, perhaps that was the most revolutionary act of all.